Welcome to One Broken Mom, a podcast dedicated to raising awareness of mental health, parenting, and self-improvement. I am the host, Ami Quiriconi. One Broken Mom is not a family show. It is meant for adults and contains sometimes adult language. The topics I cover can be serious and unsettling to people. However, I do have a sense of humor laced with a little bit of a punk rock attitude. So if you're interested in real talks about real stuff by real people so that we can all get better together, well, then you're in the right place. And so welcome. Okay, everybody, welcome back to One Broken Mom. This is going to be probably a very interesting and triggering conversation for a lot of folks. We're going to use a lot of words and descriptions, I think, of a practice that not a lot of people have had to deal with, experience, but I would have to venture to say that it's possible that some of us know people that have gone through this experience, but because of all the taboos around it, people don't talk about it, but we're going to talk about it today. I came across a post on a Facebook group that I'm a member of with my guest today, and she was talking about some work that she'd been doing in a petition that's going around in Washington State to end the practice of female genital mutilation. It goes by the squeamish acronym. Those are her words, not mine, of FGM. And so I reached out to Maryum, Saifee. I just did that.
No worries.
Like I said, and this happened to me on another show where the person was like practicing my name and then just butched it. I'm just like, nah, it happens. Anyways, but Maryum Saifee is here on the show with me, and she's a women's rights advocate, and she is an FGM survivor, and she speaks out against the practice of female genital mutilation. And I think it's brave what she's doing, and I'm excited to have her on the show. Like I said, I think this is going to be something that when we talk about trauma, through One Broken Mom, we're usually talking about, the emotional neglect and the abuse, and maybe some of the things that seem so, I'm going to air quote this for the listeners, normal, traumas that go on. But today is about traumas that other people have, and my guest has experienced, that don't get talked about. And I will tell you that when I look at some of the episodes that I publish when it comes to sexual abuse and sexual assault, I don't get a lot of comments on them. But when I look at the numbers, they are the episodes that get watched and they get listened to in a high degree, because I think there's a lot of people through one form or another have so much fear talking about things that happened to them as children that weren't their fault. And they don't know how to broach that subject either because they don't get believed. There's messaging that they can't tell the story, whatever the reasons may be. And so this is a powerful conversation. And I'm very, again, I can't say this enough. I'm in awe, of Maryum, and she's going to, speak to us about this subject matter. And I want the takeaway for everybody. I mean, we'll talk about call to actions here at the end of the interview, but I want the takeaway is for people that have no idea that this even happens and can't imagine this experience to realize that this does actually happen, that there is an experience, and that needs to be talked about. So welcome to the show, Maryum.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just jump into this totally uncomfortable topic, and let's talk about what FGM actually is. I mean, I know I saw a video of this like years ago, and it was horrifying. It was actually, I couldn't tell you the country, so I'm not going to make a speculation. But what I remember seeing is a young girl being pinned down by men, and a man using essentially a pair of scissors to remove this young woman's clitoris. And I won't even say young woman. She was a girl. She was a child. Yeah. And I just thought, this is horrifying. And never even imagined, to be honest with you, maybe this is the privilege of being a U.S. citizen here, that this even happens in the United States, but it actually does happen in the U.S. as well. So can you talk about this practice and where its origin and basis, kind of comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the issue of FGM, has largely female genital mutilation, which is, I believe, this is kind of a squeamish term, but it's global. Actually, it happens really everywhere. And typically we hear about it in, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and it's sort of, studied in maybe an anthropology class. Like, it's not even really framed with a human rights kind of lens. It's seen as, or in the gender-based violence world, it's seen as this other thing happening over there that's sort of, little pockets or whatever. So it's not really seen as something that's widespread, that's a form of gender-based violence like sexual assault or rape or domestic violence. But it very much is connected to that sort of, umbrella of different forms of violence that are rooted in power, rooted in control, rooted in patriarchy. At the end of the day, it's about controlling women and girls. So in the United States, the CDC did a study. There isn't a lot of data, to be honest, but they did a study a few years ago estimating that 500,000 girls, over 500,000, 513,000 girls and women either are living with the consequences of FGM in the United States or are at risk of undergoing FGM. So it's not a small number. And globally, it's 200 million women and girls. And this is what we know in terms of the data. And it's interesting. In 2016, the number I think was at like 120 million, and then it shot up to 200. And it was at the time I had a policy hat on and I was working on the issue. And when I was talking to the UN, a UN official, they were saying, well, the reason actually is because it's not that necessarily prevalence rates are going up. It's that we're getting data. Half the girls in Indonesia are cut before 14. I mean, just imagine half the girls. It's almost like part of the birth package. So we're seeing this happening across, race, religion, geography, socioeconomic class. I grew up in a household, mom's a doctor, dad's an engineer, very typical South Asian immigrant family. And in my case, actually, I was visiting my, aunt for summer vacation in India. My parents, again, lived in Texas. We're sort of scrappy immigrants just trying to survive. So they, every summer, because both were working, would send us, my brother and I, to live with, stay with relatives who could just take care of us for the summer. So, and it was also a way to get to know our, extended family. And that summer I happened to be going to India. So my aunt, who's, subscribes to this religious sect that believes in this, basically cut me without my parents' consent. She just sort of did it. And it was horrifying. I mean, I was 7 years old, and she's a physician. So she's not an uneducated sort of, this idea that it's like, oh, if we only educate, everything will sort of, it's really deeply rooted in patriarchy and control. So, and we know that with other forms of violence, that this is something that is transcends, it affects everyone. We see that with the Me Too movement. We see that, across the board, that it's really about a cultural shift in respecting women and girls and the dignity of bodily autonomy, but also just respect, baseline respect. So it's, I started to, after I, I actually blacked out what happened to me when I was 7. This happened. I came back to Texas, never spoke about it to anyone. And I think I, must have buried it actually, like much, I think a lot of childhood trauma, it kind of, if it's really traumatic, and I've never, to my knowledge, I mean, I've lived in places like Baghdad and Lahore, and, for my professional life has been largely in war zones overseas. And I've experienced trauma there, but it's not been, I remember it, and actually with granular detail. With this, I actually had a memory jolt when I was in class, in an undergraduate anthropology class. I was 17 years old. And somebody was talking about FGM, and I had no idea what it was. I wasn't really listening. I, half listening to this person talk, working on other homework that I had, or, whatever. And then all of a sudden she starts, describing, this typically happens at the age of 7. It usually happens by a female relative, and it's almost never discussed. And then I had the memory jolt, and it was very out of body. And I sort of, immediately, remembered the color, everything, the color of the, carpet. I mean, it was just like crazy, the whole, almost in a cinematic way, it all came flooding back. And it was jarring. And I was young, I was 17. So immediately confront my mother. I go to my dorm room, and I'm just like, and my mom's a physician. So it was like, oh, I assume she knew. So it was like, how dare you let this happen? This thing called FGM happened to me. And she had no idea what I was talking about, because she didn't she was like, I didn't know this happened. I'm so, like, are you okay? Are you in pain? I said, and for me, like you were talking about, there's different types of FGM. The type that's done in our community, it's a small subsect of Shia Islam in India. It's probably the least invasive form. So it's not the full, so FGM to go back to the definition, which I should have started with, is okay. It's the full or the part, it's the partial or full removal of the clitoris. And in some cases, it's the labia majora. I mean, it's everything. So it's different gradations. There's different types. They're all, you know, sort of, and different communities practice different types. So, and even within countries, you'll have different variations of this. So it really is kind of context specific. So in my community, it's actually the least invasive, but it's deeply traumatic regardless. I mean, I think that's one thing when I was learning about it, I was like, well, it could have been worse. It could have been more cut. Then later as an adult, I'm like, wait a minute, that's absurd. It's like being, you know, it's like saying like, oh, I wasn't raped as badly as someone else. I mean, it's all terrible, and it's all bad. Like there's no sort of, you know, justification based on you know that, but you'll see in the advocacy work in the world that we're in that because it's framed as this anthropological sort of cultural faraway thing, that people will start to say, well, you know, maybe if like we should advocate for type 1, which is what I had. Like the American Association of Pediatrics did this, it was maybe in 2010, like a decade ago. And it was advocacy groups, you know, called them out on this, but they were saying like, well, technically type 1 doesn't have the far reaching consequences in terms of maternal mortality the type maybe 3 has. So why don't we have advocate for type 1 as a form of harm mitigation, which is crazy. It's like, wait, no, like just advocate for no FGM. And that's sort of the...
So hold on a second. Advocating for 1 is harm mitigation? Like, you know...
that was the logic. It was really because of how it was framed. And so, and it's interesting because when you look at the United States, as I started researching this, because I'm not an expert on this issue. I mean, who wants to become an expert on their own trauma? Like, right. Not many people. So, but then because of, you know, I was doing work on gender equality issues writ large, and then this happened to be a subset, and so I had to learn about it anyway. But then I'm a survivor, so I was sort of entering into this space in a very, and I'm sure your listeners and others, you know, and you may have experienced this. It's hard to kind of clinically examine something that's happened, sort of that's deep rooted, it's emotional. So I started learning that actually in the United States, we often frame this as this immigrant issue, African issue, Muslim issue, or something, whatever. Mm-hmm. And actually up until the 19th century, FGM was a cure for or considered, like many medical practices, considered a cure for hysteria. So it was actually indigenous to the United States and in Europe up until the 19th century. So it's part of the history in this country. It's part of the history in many places. In terms of origins, it's hard to know where it actually sort of started. You know, people have said it's in Egypt, it's pharaonic. And I have a friend actually, when I lived in Egypt, she's an Egyptologist and she's a feminist and she does all this research on like Hatshepsut and all these, and she said, actually, there's really no evidence. It could be true, but there's no evidence that it actually is true. So that is, it's a maybe, like, you know, like many things. So I don't think people really have a strong, there isn't a lot of knowledge about the origins, but I do feel like it's in the context of this broader, you know, movement against gender-based violence. It's just part and parcel of that. So you know, where did rape origin? You know, like who knows? Like anyway, you know, anyone's guess, right? So like it's pretty much an everywhere at any time situation. So yeah, so that's kind of a bit of the context of the issue. It's a very complex issue once you start to go through the journey of, you know, unpacking.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, definitely. And, you know, using the word, the patriarchy, right, which is, you know, this male based, but, you know, it's also misogyny. I mean, right. You know, there's I mean, 100%. And I found it interesting, you know, the differences, like I said, my first experience with witnessing it, again, it taking place in another country with men. And then for you, and then seeing your story and understanding that it was actually done by women. You know, one of the guests that I have on, which will be sometime, you know, in about a month or so, was a co-author on a book called Mistakes Were Made by Not By Me. It's Carol Tarvis and Tavris. I'm terrible with last names. Anyways, we had a great discussion anyways. The book was about cognitive dissonance and self-justification. And, there's a lot of evidence, through a lot of research of why things like this persist. And that, and one of them being that when people can't undo their decisions, they're more likely to just stick with them. So when you have something that's so entrenched through, I'm going to guess thousands of years, this isn't just come up in the 1800s. This has been going on a long time. We're talking about in cultures of civilization for thousands of years. It's going to be tough to undo some of this stuff. And then, what researchers have also found in this field of, again, is in self-justification, which is that the more painful the initiation process and the more painful the ritual, the more likely you're going to continue to find the positive reasons for continuing it. And
gaslighting.
So, well, you didn't volunteer this at all. And none of these women, and these girls do ever, once it's done to you, I can imagine, then you have to kind of justify your experience and continue to perpetuate that. On and on and on, which is just, it's troubling and hard.
And it's been interesting to see sort of I think, there are all these efforts to end FGM. They've been happening for, decades. The UN has been involved, and different countries, national governments have been looking at policy, law, different interventions. But really, I think one of the most powerful, mechanisms to raise awareness is just talking about it. Actually, this podcast, for example, in my community, until I spoke out in early 2016, there were a couple people that had written like anonymous blog posts and, but it was all, I actually was, the reason I decided to share my story was because I was for work in the Gambia. I was in Banjul, and we were doing a, event or engaging religious leaders around different topics around gender equality. And, one of them happened to be FGM. And so it's a Gambian American survivor of FGM. So she was born in the Gambia and, sought asylum in the US, or moved to the US, sought asylum, and then became a powerful activist in the United States. But she said, I'm one, woman of African descent, and everyone assumes it's an African issue because I'm the face of it. I'm the only one, that's speaking out. Like if you Google FGM United States, like her name will, pop up. And so she was lamenting, because this was, I think, right before this International Day of Zero Tolerance. And so we were talking about programming and planning and how to raise awareness. And it was, in February. And she said, I wish, and I said, listen, I know it's not just an African issue. I went through it myself. And so I confided in her. I hadn't told anyone at that point, aside from my parents. And then I sort of didn't talk about it ever again. And then it just professional world, personal life kind of colliding in this moment. And she said, why don't you, I can talk to the Guardian. Why don't you speak out? And I was like, oh, no. It's like, it's like, I don't want my name to be, I was sort of embarrassed by the whole thing. I was like, I don't want to be known for this. Like, this isn't something. And so I remember telling her, but don't worry. There was somebody who had written a blog, or actually, no, I think it was a long form piece in a literary journal. Beautifully written, amazing writer. And so I thought, I'll just get her to do it, and then she had experienced so much backlash from her community that she was like, I just know. I was like, I can't put my parents, she herself, her parents were actually quite supportive of her, but they were getting a lot of which happens in these kind of, insular communities where these practices happen. Then there's the community that you have to deal with as well. So then I, called my dad, and I was like, this is so frustrating. This one person I thought would definitely say yes said no. And he's like, well, why don't you do it? And I was like, no. I was like, yet again, I don't want, and I don't want my career to be sort of subsumed by this. And then I remember him saying something really powerful. Now, the time it seemed mundane, but now I realize how powerful it was. He said, well, why are you embarrassed? You don't have anything to be ashamed about. You didn't do anything. And it was just that clicked something, whatever narrative in my head that was embedded in terms of shame, and because the point of it, the whole practice really is about shaming girls into basically submission, right? So it's a way to scare them. At 7 years old, it's a very kind of formative time. It happens to babies. It happens to, I think sometimes it happens to teenagers, but it's largely in that sort of adolescent phase. And so it's a deeply, you're trusting this person. I don't know if I was 13 if that could have happened, right? Because I would have been like, wait a minute,
Mm-hmm.
who are you? What are you doing? Whereas 7 years old, I was like, okay, I'm, being bribed with a chocolate bar. I was like, oh, I'll take the chocolate bar. And my mom was a doctor. So I thought, okay, well, this is my aunt. She's a doctor. I'm going to her clinic. Like, so I didn't even suspect anything until it happened. Then I was like, oh, something not right happened. And I sensed it and no one discussed it. So I think the movement of survivors that are courageously speaking out, I myself don't know if I would have rewind to 2016 spoken out publicly, given all of the backlash, given some of the, it's, I'd like to say I would still have done it, but I think one of the ththings I do now is to sort of raise awareness on the costs of storytelling. It's not just like liberation, and like it's all wonderful and roses and like just kind of yes, people will celebrate. Good for you, thank you for your courage. But then you also have to deal with the personal and the potentially even professional fallout. In my case, it's been a lot of just navigating kind of awkward family situations where people aren't very excited. Many of them are not pro FGM. Actually, they're not. Like I have a secular side of the family that's not religious at all. Like they're super secular, very Americanized, and just kind of very whatever, just kind of, and they're actually, I think, the ones that are the queasiest because it's a squeamish topic to associate your family with this thing. So even if they're wholeheartedly against it, they're still uncomfortable. And so I think the more we can have podcasts like these destigmatizing the issue itself, much like the Me Too movement destigmatized or tried to normalize discussing breaking the silence. I think that needs to sort of happen, and it's starting to happen on this issue. But because it's not known about, so people just don't know it exists, especially in the context of the United States. There are assumptions about it that are not accurate, but also the fact that it is just so uncomfortable. I mean, it is child sexual assault with a sharp object. I mean, that's essentially what it is. And so it's even, it triggers, I think, a lot of emotions. And for others who are survivors of maybe even different kinds of assault or trauma or violence, it's deeply uncomfortable. So it's not like saving the dolphins or, just sort of trying to do that. It's really hard, it's tough. So yeah.
Yeah. So, I think for, sex in general is hard to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just for most people, and I bring that up on the show when it's appropriate, in order to make it, again, to normalize that part of it. We've got sexual assault and abuse survivors on the show talking about their really horrible experiences because it does happen, sadly, and people don't talk about it enough or don't feel the safety in being able to do it. And again, you don't have to go out and stand on a pulpit and spread your story. Right. And not everybody has the constitution to be able to do that. And I get that. But when people can do that, they should, because that's how it comes out. I sit there and I think, like you brought up the phrase, this is sexual assault on children with a sharp object, right? Take out the religious cultural things in there, and strip it down to what it is. That's what it is.
That's what it is.
But why is it allowed? Like, why do you have to have a petition? And why do you have to have policy to outlaw this? Like, what do you know about that? Like, that makes no sense to me, right?
Exactly. No, it's true. And I mean, I think, under, the laws itself are not going to necessarily eliminate it, right? So I think it's going to be, the laws create a normative framework, just like we have laws against murder, we have laws against, rape, like sexual assault. It's not eliminating. Like nobody's like, oh yeah, this law is going to eliminate murder. Like this is so great. Like of course it's not. And so that's creating this normative that it's a not okay thing, and which we should know. Like obviously it's. I mean, in India it was interesting because for a while there was advocacy work happening on a lot of grassroots organizations that are working on this uphill battle because it's something that's just not known, and then it is, once you uncover it, people are like, oh, that's disgusting. Like, I don't want to work on this. And so then it becomes it's hard. And so, but they're just amazing, tireless activists all over the world. And in India, they were pushing, and I think it was the Supreme Court issued some advisory opinion. And it was basically saying this is already criminalized under existing Indian penal code because we have laws against child abuse, basically, and child sexual assault. So I thought that was actually kind of a win in a sense because reframing it under that actually makes sense. And in the U.S., you know, we have existing legislation against child abuse and child sexual assault, but having the FGM, like you know, pulled out and sort of having a standalone law, I think is still important. It's not, it's complementary. It's not a sort of one or the other. I think it's like the more the better, because of how it's been framed historically as, oh, well, these religions, you know, because in Christianity, I mean, there are white Christian women in the United States who have undergone FGM. One of the things that was I went on a retreat, this was back in November, with other survivors, and I met somebody who is from Kentucky. Her dad, you know, was a priest. I don't know which denomination, but her story was chilling because it was exactly the same as mine. I mean, we couldn't possibly be more different. You know, she grew up in kind of all over the South. Her dad was a priest that traveled, so, you know, all over the U.S. And so settled in Kentucky, you know, like has, you know, she's probably a little older than me, but has, like, you know, I don't know how many kids, a lot of kids, I know, like that. And, you know, just different backgrounds. Like, you know, I'm from a South Asian immigrant family. She came, you know, she's like a white Christian, you know, probably immigrant from other generations ago. And so it was, but she said, you know, I was 7 years old, and, you know, my sister and I were taken and for a special girls trip is what they called it, which is kind of what my aunt did. She sort of bribed me with this chocolate bar. And then, and Jenny, you know, from Kentucky, she basically was like, yeah, I was bribed with, in a sense, like she was like, oh, our mom baked a cake for us, you know? And so there were all these things that I was like, wow, like your story is essentially my story, except if this hadn't happened to us, there's no way our paths would have, I mean, or it would be highly unlikely we wouldn't be on a retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains talking about trauma. Like, I can't imagine, you know, maybe our lives would have stumbled together, but highly unlikely, the serendipity of that. So I think that was really, for me, fascinating, because the person I connected with the most in terms of her story and it resonating was someone who is so radically different from me in many ways. And I think, and I asked her, why did you speak out? You know, it's like, there's so few people in the, you know, I assumed it was just a one-off quirky thing, and I didn't realize it was systemic. It happened to her sister, it happened to her congregation, and it's as structural and systemic as what happened to me. It's just that nobody talked about it. So she said there was a case in Detroit, in the United States, that basically in November of 2018, the federal law was overturned. And so that's why when we get to the petition, the federal law was overturned, banning FGM in the United States, in a district court in Detroit. And so there were, you know, there's an appeals process. And so there were activists involved in, you know, amicus briefs to explain it more so that we could get this restored, the ban restored. And so she said, you know, I just thought about these 9 girls. They were transported from Minnesota and Illinois to Michigan. They were all 7 years old, same age. And they were brought to a clinic in Detroit, and they were cut. And she just thought, I can't, like, I have to say something, because this is in the United States. This is my country. And, you know, and it just triggered her to sort of speak out, basically. So I think everyone has their, you know, kind of motivations, but I think for all of us, it's pretty connected to ending it. So that the next generation, in my case, it was my dad, but it was also my niece. Actually, my niece is 7. I was visiting her around the time that I had just come back from this trip from the Gambia. So she just happened to be the same age, you know, and when I was, you know, and we're very close, like we have very similar personalities. Like, she's very, you know, like loves art and loves, you know, all this, she's very creative, loves to travel, though she's never left North America. She's 10, so she's never left North America. She keeps explaining, I've never left North America, but if I could, like during this pandemic, she was like, these are the places I'd go. So we have a whole list, like once we get a vaccine and we can go back to traveling. But yeah, so she was just so gregarious and like bold and confident and sassy and just kind of, and I was like, you know what? I was like that actually before I was cut. And so I realized, I was like, there was a me before I was cut, and then there was a me after. And I think that kind of also, it made me realize it wasn't just the physical cut. It was because that healed. In my case, it was not as severe. And so I don't have like the physical scars of it, I guess, but the psychological, the emotional, you know, even when I started researching it more in my own community, why are they doing this? Like, what is this? To answer your, you know, the question of why, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I think it's rooted in controlling. women and girls so that they're maybe not promiscuous. And so they'll never officially say that this is the reason. They'll say it's like for hygiene, for purification, or they'll make something up. But then the term in our community, I don't speak the language. I mean, I kind of somewhat speak, but not really speak it. But but I can one of the terms for what's taken out, like sort of the flesh itself, the clitoral, whatever piece of the clitoris, it's called haram ki boti, which basically translates into English from Gujarati, the language that the community speaks, to sinful flesh. And I was like, that's so telling. Like sinful flesh, like shame is rooted into this. Like it's actually literally seen as sinful. So the idea that it's a purification ritual, I guess how you interpret purity is one thing. I mean, there's purity culture. You see that even, in Christian communities and all over actually, across Orthodox Jewish, like it's everywhere. But Hinduism, actually it's everywhere. So it's not specific to any one religion, but it is interesting, the nomenclature, right? So that actually, for me, was a window into, yes, this is about shame, basically. And so the reason because it's never talked about until I started speaking out in others, it was me in like a groundswell at that time, because it was this case. I published the piece, or we published the piece in The Guardian at the same time this trial was just breaking. So in 2016, charges were filed. Then people were like, wait, what? This is happening. These aren't African, Americans of African descent, or, immigrants or whatever. These are like Americans of South Asian descent. This doesn't compute. They're wealthy. Like this doesn't make sense. So people were kind of confused by this. So then it was, more people said, actually, yeah, we had our own internal Me Too movement. And actually, it sort of did coincide with the Me Too movement, now that I think about it. So there was momentum from Me Too. There was this court case. And then there was just people, me, others starting to publicly speak out. And in my case, I'm so lucky that my parents, I'm so lucky because my parents are so supportive. And, they could have said, let's just think that was a terrible thing. Let's never discuss this again. And instead they've become just such champions. Like every time I'm like feeling queasy and like uncomfortable and have I overexposed myself, I'm always getting this kind of backup, like, no, like this is a terrible thing. Like my mom's a doctor. So when I told her, hey, this was actually a cure for hysteria by physicians, like, doctors. And I remember her response was just perfect. Actually, it's like a perfect line. She was like, that's crazy to me. This was a cure for hysteria. I'm going to tell other doctors, like, this is crazy. And I was like, crazy hysteria. Don't you get it? And, it was just such a, moment of like, this is so absurd. Like, what are we doing? So having parents that are my rock sort of support network, having a brother, who's supportive, has been really grounding, because I think a lot of survivors don't have that. I mean, this is a family issue. This is an intergenerational form of violence that's passed down and it's not discussed. And so it creates really complex feelings. It's not if my mom, for example, let's say she had known or whatever, even still, it's complex. I wouldn't disown her. I wouldn't say, okay, you're no longer my mother. I mean, and so for a lot of survivors, they're navigating this. Like, how could you let this happen to me? But at the same time, the mothers are feeling, or the aunts, or whoever's involved in this decision-making process, they feel guilt because they feel they have to do it so that the society around them, in this case, is the community, right, accepts them in order to get. I remember this. My dad, I think, told me that my aunt said, I did the right thing, because in order for her to get married, she had to have this done. And so she was still thinking unapologetically, like, I did her a favor, like, you should be thanking me. And so that's where, and my dad's not religious. So he was like, yeah, you did us a favor. Like, just like, and he doesn't have a relationship with her anymore. I mean, he sort of had to cut that, because of what happened to me, he just, it was such a betrayal. So it's a tough topic because it opens up intergenerational and family wounds. And those are probably the hardest. And I'm sure, others who have gone through incest or other things that are kind of in that same way, kind of muddled. Like, it's a really tough, it's tough to unpack. I'm still unpacking even now, and trying to understand, what happened and how I've internalized it. And then what that means in terms of my sort of well-being, like mental health.
Yeah. Women face this backlash, across the board in lots of different areas. I mean, you just see where, the choice of doing something different and the consequences of that and the aggressions that you get as a result of that feel like they're worse than just going along with it. And which is horrifying. I mean, you and I have both used that word. We'll probably use it a few more times here, but I mean, this is what we're talking about, is this horrifying choice between stopping this and doing the right thing, ending this violence, versus the rejection of your family, your culture. You don't know who's safe and who's not safe out there, especially when people are shamed into silence. I mean, it is a sickening form of abuse and control, I mean, just like a head scratching. But you're right. Like in incest, one of my guests was actually the victim, a survivor of father-daughter incest, and even when she was, trying to speak up in court, was still ostracized by family for bringing the shame to the public, and exposing all of this. And I always, meeting with people and talking, like with you about your story and stuff like that, I'm always just thinking, I just can't even imagine, the waters that you have to swim through and navigate, on this.
Yeah, I mean, I realized how lucky I was with my dad, because I took it for granted. I'm like, whatever, parents give advice, I may or may not listen. It's just kind of like, it goes in one ear, kind of out the other. But then later I realized, my God, when he said that, like how profound. He was probably just saying, hey, why are you ashamed? Like, you didn't do anything. It's very matter of fact. But I was like, having my father say that to me specifically was a real, I mean, that's why I'm an advocate. Without him kind of nudging me in this direction, because I remember saying, well, it's complicated because for work I have to get clearance, and it's just this whole process. And he was like, yeah, but can't you just do that? Like, and I was like, yeah, I guess I could. Like, I didn't want to write the piece. So I was just kind of like, well, you don't understand like how complex things are. He was like, it doesn't seem like it. It seems like you applied for the clearance and then you get it. And then sure enough, that's what happened. It was pretty easy process. It wasn't even that difficult of a process, but I just kind of didn't want to do it. And I had someone kind of nudging me in a very like sort of kind way throughout and I realized like that's so unusual. I mean, having a family, like having somebody not be ashamed or sort of not transfer the shame or re-traumatize me by saying, but you're like, yes, of course, like you didn't do anything, but this is a deeply shameful thing. And I feel like that's kind of what happens to a lot of survivors, is that their families, in many cases, we did a study, actually, I'm part of an organization, I'm their advisory board chair. It's an organization based both in the US and in India. So there's 2 branches, and they did a data collection study, just sort of a survey on attitudes, an attitudinal survey on what people in the community think about this. Now that this case has been, brought a spotlight onto a very under-focused, nobody had heard of my community. Even other Muslims are like, what is this group? Like, it's small, like no one's heard of it. And it keeps to themselves, it's just very insular. And so then all of a sudden they decided, we don't know actually how people feel until we ask and do the data collection. And it was interesting because the community itself, our community, is very tech savvy. Everyone's on WhatsApp, everyone's sort of hyper connected. And so it was easy to do a digital survey, actually, because people could respond. And and of the people who responded, it's like over 80% were like, I'm a survivor, I would not want this done to my daughter. So in many cases, it's the people inside these communities like don't want to do this. I was watching a film, it was a Kurdish Iraq, like, so it was just, but it was actually included some commentary around FGM, and there was a husband. It was so fascinating. So this husband, Kurdish husband, and I think it was in Kurdish Iraq, was talking about, so the documentarian was interviewing him about FGM, about the issue and the topic. It's very taboo. And he said, listen, I would never have this done to my daughter. Like, I love my wife. Like, it's horrible. She's in so much pain. Every time we're intimate, she's in pain. And now that we're done having kids, like, I don't want to traumatize her. So it's just like, it destroyed their kind of intimate sex life, married, just like, and clearly this husband like is devoted, loves his, you can feel it. He loves his wife, like from how he's talking about her. And so he was like, now that I know what this is, I have no interest in having my daughter go through this. Like, so it's interesting too, as like in many cases, men are completely unaware. Like my dad had no idea because it's just not discussed. It's like women do it to women, and at least in our community. Largely that's what I've seen, is that it's women doing it to women, but the broader architecture is typically, if it's And the reasons all vary. So some of it is religion, some of it is culture, some of it is tribe, like in Sierra Leone, for example, and Gambia actually was interesting because it's a majority Muslim country, but some tribes do it and some don't. If you're Wolof speaking, maybe you have one practice. If you don't, so it's all very contextual, even within countries, within regions, that you would expect there to be some kind of trend. So that was a learning experience for me, because I assumed it's all rooted in religion, but it's not. It can be. And just to say, just for folks who, because it's getting so into the weeds, it's not actually mentioned in the Bible or in the Quran or any religious doctrine. So this is sort of kind of patriarchal interpretations that are, sayings. In our case, it's a very weak hadith, and that's like a saying of the prophet that hasn't really been verified. And there's a whole process for verifying the authenticity of what these sayings were. It's just people overheard. It's like telephone, and so this was and so you have religious scholars at the mainstream and like Al-Azhar, which is based in Cairo, and then you have mainstream religious scholars across the board saying this is not part of the religion. Like, it's literally not included. So this is just made up. And so they'll say this is a cultural thing, it's made up. But at the same time, you have religious leaders who are perpetuating this. So you have to then educate them to say, like in our case, in this community, to tell the religious leader, hey, this is not part of the prophetic tradition. But at the same time, it's all about power. So if my sense is, my read on this is that, it's once you sort of, if a leader is supposed to be infallible and then they sort of make a mistake, it's hard for them to also revisit their opinion on something. So right. I think it's really going to take a groundswell of people within the community just saying no. We're just not going to do this. And so I think it's starting to happen. I mean, I'm seeing it. I'm seeing cousins of mine private message me, because I'm always ranting on Facebook, social media, about sign my petition. Like, why are we even having conversations to ban FGM? It just should be so obvious. And they'll say, like, you're not venting into a black hole, like, every time you're angry, because of you, we're now going to be watching our daughter, like, when we go visit maybe family members who might be pro doing this, like, or feel like that. It's not even people are excited to do this. They just feel they have to do it. They feel like it's part of the culture and it's sort of this norm, and it just happens to be a harmful tradition. So there are many traditions we have that are fantastic, but this is just one that needs to just, it's harmful, and it's a human rights abuse. It's not beyond harmful. I've started using, because there's all this phrasing, harmful practices. And we're like, nope, it's a human rights violation. It's child sexual assault with a sharp object. Like, call it what it is, because when you start to infantilize it a bit and say, oh, this is like this tradition over there, then it makes it seem innocuous, Yeah.
Well, one of the words that I remember it being used, probably, like I said, around the time that I first saw it, which could be 15 years ago or so, when I saw that video, is female circumcision.
Right. They call it, make it sound like it's like, oh, just like male circumcision.
It's the same as males. And it's like, no. Yeah. What I saw was nowhere close to that. Nobody took scissors and cut off the head of the penis of a boy and call it circumcision. Like, that's not.
The equivalent of FGM, so I never even use the term female circumcision because it's so, it muddles everything. And and the semantics are very powerful, right? Because once you, so the equivalent of FGM if it were happening to a man, is castration. Like, the clitoris, like, it's castration. So it's like, if you're going to call it female castration rather than circumcision, because the circumcision makes it sound like a medical practice. Like, we have that, and there are discussions around, male circumcision, a whole movement to end that as well. But it's very different. I mean, and I have no judgment on that. But I'm very careful to not conflate the two, because often when I speak out, actually men will say, well, you're not speaking out against, male circumcision. I was like, it's like, more power to you on that one. Like, it's not my cause. Like, it's just, right. I mean, it's no judgment. It's not saying that I'm pro or against it. I have no views on it. And I'm actually pro bodily autonomy. So I'd probably lean towards just, like consent and, and sort of, but at the end of the day, it's a totally different practice. And so the idea of conflating them is also used by pro-FGM activists, or pro advocates, like
right.
within communities that want to uphold these traditions. They'll say that this, if men have the right to be circumcised, so should women. I've heard these arguments. You're like, this is nuts. And, but they'll sort of say, but it's benign. It's just a pinprick, so there was a lot of that language that came out in Detroit after the Detroit case, where the consultant to the defense, who happened to be Alan Dershowitz, was, our community hired Alan Dershowitz as like a consultant. So he wasn't the defense attorney, but he was kind of guiding. He did some op-ed pieces about how this is he called it a quote, a benign pinprick, and just tried to sort of minimize the gravity of this, that this is not technically FGM, what happened to me and so many others. And so that's another, the word choice is so critically important. And it's why I actually use the term, as squeamish as it is, female genital mutilation, because mutilation is what it is, actually. I mean, it really is, it's unnecessary, it's harmful, and it's a bad thing. And I think that word pretty much, I mean, it's not the best word, but like it encapsulates all those things. If you say, circumcision or just something else, like it's a bit more benign, I personally, I totally, if survivors use that, I think they should use whatever language they want, and whatever, means whatever, because before I used to not use the term FGM. I would use other terms, and now I'm sort of owning it, because it's like, actually it is, I mean, if I could rename it, I would just call it child abuse with a sharp object. I mean, I that's what really it is, because people still see it as an other thing but when you reframe it as human rights, when you reframe it as a form of gender-based violence, then everyone can kind of be like, oh, okay, it belongs in this kind of, in a sort of bucket that I'm sort of familiar with. But when you call it something else, and that's like use other terms, then you otherize it, and then you make it seem like, oh, but that's not my business, and I don't want to, these other cultures, who am I to say, I'm not from there. And it's really to say, nope, this is an everybody issue, just like all the other things. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you've got some work that you've been doing, so I want to talk about kind of the call to action. But first, I want to talk about the petition that you have in Washington State, because, like I said, there is a petition, and for everybody that's listening, in the podcast notes there will be a link to that petition, so that you can get on and sign it. Please sign this. So let's talk about how that came about, and that right there.
So it sort of came to, serendipity again. I mean, so this federal case in November of 2018, I felt pretty confident that the appeal would restore the ban and everything would be fine. So I was blindsided when, and it was, so the appeal was dropped, or no, the appeal, so the decision was made to overturn the ban, which was sort of shocking. I just assumed the appeal would fix everything. I was like, of course, like, you just need some more information and it'll be fine. And then when when the appeal was dropped, that was March of 2019. That was last year. So just recently, then I was sort of blindsided. I was like, oh, wait a minute, like, what's going on here? This is not what because this isn't my full-time job. Like, this is just like, like I have many hobbies like that. I would like to, like, I have my paintings in the back, which I love. I've started doing, during the pandemic, and kind of reconnecting with all these things. The last thing I really wanted to do was work on a petition on this topic, on a form of trauma. So, but then it was out of necessity, because I was like, no one else is, I mean, there it's not that no one else is, there are survivors working on this, but not many of us. And largely for the reasons I discussed earlier, the backlash, it is so hard to do it. So I feel it's incumbent on me to be outspoken, because I'm lucky enough to have parents that are supportive. I'm lucky enough to be able to do this, like, and not many can, and I would never push anyone to, because even with the support networks, it's not easy. So so in that case, I was like, okay, we need to now push at the state level. So there were all these campaigns happening. There was one in Massachusetts that a group of friends, amazing activists, largely survivors, wrote a petition on change.org to, and they had been advocating really, for a couple years actually. And so just actually a couple weeks ago, time is, I don't even know what day it is anymore with the pandemic, but recently there was the law was, the FGM ban for Massachusetts was passed into law after like years of advocacy work. And so I decided, there was another, the person I met in Kentucky, who in North Carolina, who lives in Kentucky, she had launched a petition as well for her home state. So everyone was sort of launching these petitions. And I'm, was born and raised in Texas. My parents were there, but Texas actually thankfully has a ban on FGM. So I didn't, and then, so then I thought, okay, Washington State, which is where I used to live. Actually, I worked for a domestic violence organization as an AmeriCorps volunteer. Like before I started my career, like I, was in Seattle years ago. My brother, actually, I moved there because my brother lived there, and I was like one of those younger siblings that wanted to follow him around. He was getting annoyed, I'm sure, but he stayed. So he stayed in Seattle. I eventually left because of the rain. The rain was too much for me, and so I was like Sunlight, Texas, Indian origin. I was like, I need sunlight, I guess. And so I moved away. I moved to New York actually, and then my brother was there, and I was like, I have networks there from my AmeriCorps days, and then my brother is a constituent, so I approached him to say, hey. And he agreed to do a petition because I said I really can't sleep at night. Like it's crazy to me that there's like no federal law, and I know that my community actually after the appeal was dropped, then they were just like, this is a constitutional green light. Like we're good to go. Like we can keep cutting. And I was like, like this is a nightmare. Like this is empowering them to think that this is actually like constitutionally okay. And it's not. I mean, because even the dropping the appeal was not that's not the message. Like they took that as the message though, right? So because they're saying, well, if they can't get us, okay, like we'll keep doing this. So then I realized that we're going to need to ban this in all 50 states, like and now even if the federal ban, and I hope I feel confident it's going to be restored in the near future. I can't imagine that not happening. Part of it was just the reasons why are kind of logistical, like the Commerce Clause is constitutional kind of like nitpicky thing that is very technical. And so there's a very strong bipartisan push to restore the federal ban. So I'm not, I know it'll happen, but in the meantime, as a fail-safe, it's important to have all 50 states, even if we have a federal ban, just to reinforce. All of this is reinforcing. So so that's why we did we co-drafted, it's in his voice because he's a constituent, this petition. And really my brother's not like a hardcore activist-y type, he's just like a regular guy in Seattle, just worked at Microsoft and Amazon, all the usual, whatever companies and like
places.
Yeah, exactly. He's just been there for like now, I don't know, like over a decade, 15 years, I think. It's been a long time. He's been in Seattle for his most of his adult life, wife, kids, everything. Like, he loves Seattle, loves the Seahawks, like just very, so it's like living his life. And then I'm like, hey, can you do this for me? So it's definitely like, I was really grateful because it's not easy. And he's a guy, so it's not that easy for, someone, to sort of take this on and that summer he was there that summer when this happened. So I mean he wasn't there when it happened, but like we were both together visiting this aunt of ours that summer. So it's traumatic. I mean it's hard. So I'm really proud of him for his voice, like lending his voice. And so the petition will be on the links for the after this is aired. And I think it's it's so critical because it helps raise awareness on just the issue that the title is like FGM is an American issue. Just put it out there as like it's not, because people are like, oh, that's something in Sudan, and it's like, yes, it is, and it's here. So so I think that's been really powerful, is to sort of people that I worked with in Seattle, people who I knew are like, oh wow, I had no idea, and I had no idea you went through this. Like that's even sort of more crazy. People just, like you said in the beginning, there are people you may not even know have gone through it, and they're just not, for good reasons, probably not speaking out. And so no judgment on them, because it's super tough if you do. And it's not necessarily, I think it's important though. So it's important to create an environment or an ecosystem where it's okay to talk about these things, because I think internalizing them is also really, it does have an impact. If you don't speak out, it has an impact. And if you do, it has an impact. So regardless, the more we can create safe spaces for people. So the petition is partially that. It's a cathartic movement to just raise awareness, but also to criminalize FGM so that girls, aren't, many girls either are transported to their home countries, specifically to have it done, because there's no, now that we have no federal ban, there might be more happening. I'm imagining there will be more happening in states that don't have bans. So that was one of the reasons why, you know, there was a reason why the girls were transported from Minnesota and Illinois. Both of those states had state bans on FGM, to Michigan, which had no state ban. So, I mean, so states in the United States that don't have have not criminalized FGM could become destination states for those that want to practice, because they'll know that, you know, from the case of what just happened, that it's hard to actually prosecute. So I think it's important for us to close the federal loophole with, and Washington is an important state. It's a progressive state. It's, you know, I mean, there are a lot of people from communities actually that do practice FGM, right? So again, not an immigrant issue per se, but there are communities. We know it's across all communities, but a lot of high prevalence communities are in Washington. And so it can make an impact in terms of safeguarding. And it also actually, I think, many parents, like moms, I don't think want to do this. Like, nobody's really excited to be like, I'm excited to like traumatize my child. Nobody is. Right. So, you know, and if they are, they're creating an argument of like, it's like sort of, it's not even like they want to, they just feel like, okay, it's for marriage, it's for acceptance, it's for whatever.
The justification, the self-justification. Yeah.
Yeah, the B-roll justification in people's heads. But it's actually not in their heart. You know, when you really talk to people, it's rare. I don't think I've really met anyone who's like, yes, I'm thrilled to do this. Like, so if you have a law, it actually helps the parents who don't want to do this. Like, they can be like, oh, it's illegal. Like, too bad. Like, can't do this. Don't want to break the law. So they're already not wanting to do it, and you're giving them an extra reason to not do it. And so sure, there are going to be people who will find loophole, you know, really determined, feeling like they must, you know, because the community says so. And so, yeah, so you'll have to, you know, that's why there's the education piece, and that's why there's the outreach and the podcasts like these and others to kind of destigmatize, break the silence, and then also really unpack the root causes. Like, why is this actually happening? Because I think once people understand root causes, then it's a matter of like, okay, now it all kind of, you know, makes sense. It's like when Brene Brown talks about shame, you're like, oh, okay. Like, now I sort of get it. Like, it intellectualizes it a bit in a way that you can see it in a different way. So I think that's similar to this as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, within a lot of traumas, you know, out there, you know, that's part of it. Part of it is owning your experience with it, and hopefully removing the shame. Again, you know, so much of what happens to us in our childhood.
Yep.
And we don't have a lot of power at that point in our lives. Exactly. And we, you know, but as kids, we feel like we did something, there's, you know, whatever. And then you know, there is no justification for it. I mean, I think we all agree on that. There's absolutely no justification for this. There's no medical benefits. There's no emotional benefits. It's all bad, all bad there. But that perpetuation, like a lot of traumas, you know, why do we pass on abuse? Why do we pass on, you know, sexual assault? I mean, those things come from healing the people, you know, and then because you can't change what happened, but if you can start to heal the people in the moment.
Yes.
Hopefully, you know, you're able to then start to, you know, break that chain, that intergenerational link.
That's exactly what it is. It's breaking this chain, this intergenerational chain of trauma. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Well, you know, I have all these questions, like the legal things, and I'm like, we could go on forever. We can do this another time, because I don't think everybody wants to hear what's going into my head, because I'm sitting here like, okay, well, so then prosecution, and then, you know.
I've learned so much about like the Commerce Clause, like who knew, like all these things that I had it's like, how did this wild, you know, curveball come into this? And I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I don't know. So I've become like a makeshift, like learning all these things. I think that happens to many of us who just stumble into the activism work. It's just, you just sort of have to then, it's like a rabbit hole. You keep going and going. And, but I've been so gratified, like, there's been so much, as much as there's been some backlash here and there, which can be tough, the support is also pretty overwhelming. People are, I've been really, you know, gratified by how many family members of mine and friends and even high school friends I've not been in touch with since high school, like, or forever, have kind of come in saying, oh, wow, like, how can I support you? And how can I, so that's been really so powerful. It's like you build kind of another community around these issues. And I think just in the last few years, I mean, since I started the work, it's been, the needle has moved, and I'm palpably seeing a shift. I can't necessarily, there's no metric to say X number of, percentage of minds change per se, but just anecdotally, there's one, I remember this after the Guardian piece came out, because I felt like very, kind of both liberated, like, oh, like this burden has like been lifted, but then very self-conscious afterwards, because I was like, is everyone just like looking at me, it's like even on like dating profile, I was like, oh my God, did they Google me? And then did they see this? Like, what are they thinking? Like, I'm thinking all these things, like, like now I'm just sort of this public, like the first thing you see is no longer my profession or whatever, artwork or whatever nonsense, like not nonsense, whatever stuff I used to do, like that was still part of me, gets subsumed by this thing, right? And so I think that was, it was all worth it actually when months later, so I'm kind of going through this wave of emotions that I'm sure a lot of people who do end up speaking publicly about their trauma may face, right? This sort of like exhilaration, but also like it's a roller coaster of just sort of, what have I done? But oh no, I have to do this. And so it was somebody reached out on Facebook, and it was somebody who I never, didn't know. And she said, I can never speak out. Like, I'm from the community. I went through FGM. I actually have a very, very similar story. I'm from Texas. I was like, it was very weird. We had a lot of similarities. She also had like the epiphany of remembering her trauma in the classrooms as well. So it was very a lot like parallel in some ways. And then she said, but I'll never be able to share my story because just the backlash, I just can't do it. We're so embedded in this community, we just can't do it. So I said, oh, like, thank you so much for sharing. That makes me feel so much better in terms of like, I'm at least helping others heal, even if it's in the shadows and we don't know, we're not able to publicly say it. At least it makes me feel better. Then I just forgot about it, didn't even think about it. And then, months, not even a month, maybe a month and a half later, 6 weeks later, on the New York Times, there was an op-ed piece or an editorial piece on Detroit, what's going on with the case and FGM and, what is this thing and happening. And she went even a step beyond what I would do, which at that time, which I was never putting my face to this. I was like, you can put my name, you can do an animation about this, but you can never put my face to this. And so, my Google image search will not have my name, my face, and FGM. I was like, no. And now it does. But at that time, I was like, no way. And she actually was on the cover of the health section of the New York Times. The same person who said, I'll never be able to speak out, eventually ended up going 1,000 steps beyond what I was willing to do, which is so brave. And she was interviewed as part of this like piece on FGM in the United States. And she was, on the cover of the health section with her, just very like, beautiful and defiant and unapologetic. It was amazing. So when I saw that, because I was looking at it and I reposted it, and then she had added me on Facebook as a friend. She said, oh, thanks for sharing. And then I was like, oh my God, like I was like, that's you, like, wow. Like, and so just in the course of a few weeks, that transformation happened for someone else. So this ripple effect, the butterfly effect of what we don't know, what this podcast is going to mean for someone who's an FGM survivor, or potentially someone who's gone through another trauma and they're trying to sort of unpack it. So that's the beauty of, it's not easy. It's not very tangible, but it's like, you have to kind of have faith that that's what keeps me going, I guess. The faith that like, this is releasing some courage and positivity and resilience.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's why, again, I appreciate you taking the time to be able to sit and talk about this. It's crappy to have to normalize hard conversations like this, but it's necessary, to do this. And I can, like I said, especially when they have a sexual nature to them, they become even tougher to do. Because I didn't mean to laugh, but it was kind of funny of like, who thinks about like their dating profile,
I
know, and sitting there going, oh, good Lord. Oh yeah. So I'm gonna have to have that conversation at dinner, right?
No, it's true. I was just thinking like, because I was so focused on the professional, like, oh, well, I just don't want to get pigeonholed as like an expert on one issue, but I'm expert on so many other things. And then I was like, oh my God, the dating profile. And then I was like, so that's been like an unpacking. I'm like, people aren't necessarily, even if they're Googling me, they're not necessarily associating a negative thing with this or whatever, but it is the unpacking. It's like when you put yourself out there publicly, it's a journey in terms of your own navigating that. So
yeah. Side story. I went on one date with a guy, and he somehow, like, I must have this part of my personality sitting there, and I'm usually pretty quiet, and he said, asked me about the podcast, and this is what I do, that kind of thing. And then he just unpacked his life on it. And I could see the sense, but I could see kind of like it spiraled out of control for him. Like he just started talking and he couldn't stop, and it was done. It was like the only time I ever saw him after that. I went and met with friends. I said, I don't think he wants to see me again, because it was like he had this uncomfortable sense of purge that just kind of came because of what I did.
And then you're like,
and then didn't want to and I'm like, yeah, okay.
Armchair therapist. Like, I don't know what's going on. So we're on a date. Okay. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyways. Oh man. Well, Maryum, I really appreciate you and everything that
you're doing. And thank you for having me. This was such a great conversation, and everyone signed the petition as well.
Yes, definitely sign the petition. Petition. Oh my gosh, my words in the morning. Speaking sometimes very hard. Are there any other resources, if anybody's listening to this show and they are a survivor and they want to know, where do they go to get started? Because we talked about it, coming out to your family and talking to your own family may be the most dangerous place to begin this conversation. So where can somebody start this conversation with somebody else that might know and help them start to do this?
That's a great question. So there's a U.S. network to end FGMC that launched a year and a half ago or so relatively recently, and it has an exhaustive list. If you Google U.S. network, and I'll actually put that in the link. I'll send you the link to it so you can, so that folks can see it. And they have a list of all the resources that are sort of on mental health, on well-being, on the legal, sort of digging into sort of the case itself to figure out what the legislation for lawyers that want to become advocates, and for survivors, I would say the most important thing, the thing I've learned is the mental health piece is you may not think I was like, I come from a culture where it's like, no one goes to a therapist. It's like product of Indian immigrants. I think I told my dad, and he was like, why would you talk to people? I was like, because I guess he just thinks it's weird, but it's like, whatever. He's like kind of supportive, but like not, just kind of, okay, fine, American culture, just doesn't see it as but I think for many, I would say, even if it's not a culturally acceptable thing to do, that can be really transformative. And so I actually, because I'm on a sabbatical and on limbo, and I'll share this link as well. I'm sort of in a issue with, I didn't have health insurance for my job. And so I sort of can't really afford to go to a mental health. I mean, we don't have insurance. Everything is so expensive. Mm-hmm. So, and even when you do, mental health support is expensive, but there's an organization called Give an Hour. And so they help veterans, they help others, but it's a pro bono service. It's where somebody is assigned to you for an hour a week or 45 minutes a week. And it's just great. So I think there are a lot of these resources around mental health, if you have your insurance and it covers it, highly recommend it. Because I think for survivors, the biggest thing I'm learning is that we tend to pour everything out, and then there's no self-care. So then you're just sort of like, okay, I'll tell, even after this, I'm going to need to take a break and maybe just have some chai, just sort of whatever, get in the headspace to get back into my day. So for survivors, I would say, there's no pressure to speak out. And if you do, and even if you don't, I think the mental health piece is so critical. And I think for people in the philanthropy space, or, as a call to action, I would say to donors that are working in the space is to invest in the mental health and well-being of survivors that are, especially those that are participating in these advocacy movements. I'm part of an organization that really uses storytelling, which is so powerful. These short videos, I think the one that you saw that's embedded in the petition, but they are grassroots. They're just kind of doing this all a lot of them are doing it on the side as their side hustles in addition to their regular jobs. And so they don't have the resources to necessarily always bring in the trauma-informed clinician to come in and be there. And so the more that donors can sort of see, oh, this is another must-have, not a nice-to-have, but a must-have, I think is really critical. So so I would say amplify the stories of survivors, invest in the data collection around, prevalence, why it's happening, attitudes around it, and that's more like the UN and others to do that, but also other nonprofits, organizations. So funders should also look at both mental health and data in this space, and then and then just I think normalizing it like through podcasts like these to sort of destigmatize the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Great. And so again, for everybody that's listening, there will be links in the podcast notes
there will
for everybody to go to. Well, Maryum, again, thank you so much. I do appreciate this. I understand too the need to kind of decompress after conversations like this. No, I totally understand. And I'm sorry something like this happened to you. And I think that it is important, for other people to realize we have to look outside our lens. And I think 2020 has been the year for people to start to do that, especially white people, to start to look outside their own lens. And this is something else that if we're broadening our horizons and taking some accountability for how closed off we may have been to other experiences, to realize that there are these other experiences in our country as well. And in our country, in the US, for all my US listeners here, I know that other people listen worldwide, but this is also a global thing. That there is this violence committed against girls, in the name of, culture, religion, whatever it is, but it's misogynistic, it's horrifying. It has to stop. And, and being able to provide all the survivors like yourself, the resources, the ability to come out and safely, find a community that's ready to hold them, hold and let them know that it's okay. And I do believe there are more people that, feel the way I do about this. This is terrible. And
absolutely.
We're ready. We're ready for the people that are ready to come forward, the women that are ready to come forward to do something to support that. I mean, I think that's also what we've seen in 2020 is a lot of people saying we're ready to support those who need our support and to be there for that. So.
It's a whole, I mean, there's a reckoning and there's this like almost cathartic, collective awakening that I think it's everywhere. And so it's such a powerful time right now. Definitely.
Yep. It is. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep. Cool.